Hello and welcome to the Voice of the Province. I'm your host, Troy Glover. Tonight we're going to be talking about manufacturing in New Brunswick, and with us tonight we have Dr. Emery, the Vaughan Chair in Regional Economics at the University of New Brunswick. Now, thanks for joining us for tonight.
No problem.
Now, tonight we're going to be talking about manufacturing in New Brunswick. Can you tell the folks at home a little about your background in the field?
Sure. So I'm a regional economist, which means I'm studying opportunities to grow the provincial economy, the income level that we have, and the ultimate goal is to create a place that's prosperous so we can pay for all those public services that we like so much. And to do that, we need income, and the income will then lead to tax revenues, which New Brunswickers love to collect. And so what we're looking for quite often is what are the strengths of a province or a region? What do we have an opportunity to do more of to make ourselves better off?
Now, Canada's economy has performed well in recent years. Now, what would you say has contributed to that?
Energy.
Energy?
Most of the growth in Canada has been investment driven by the energy sector. And what we're seeing now is that with the attempts to shut down Alberta's oil sands and other energy development in Canada, investment is disappearing. And so what we're living off of now is a lot of sort of lingering consumption spending from personal borrowing, some government spending, but we haven't seen the government infrastructure money yet. So we're heading into a period of time now where we've turned away from our traditional strengths as a producer, and we're moving into territory where we don't have a replacement yet, and we're about to learn that in a very hard way.
So we'd say we're kind of like in the purgatory sort of sense in our economy as of now.
You've been driving your car down the highway and you decided to turn the engine off and see how far you can glide. So that's what we're doing right now.
Now, why is there concern that we could be facing GDP growth issues in the coming years?
Well, since 2008, this provincial economy really hasn't grown. We went from being an economy that was headed towards converging with the higher performing places like even Ontario. We had our productivity, which is the amount we produce in an hour of work, with a unit of labor was converging towards that of Ontario and going well above that of Nova Scotia. And productivity is a sign that you're good at doing something. Since 2008, what we've seen is our labor productivity has been falling and converging back towards Nova Scotia, which is bad because they're low. And we've been falling behind other provinces that we were starting to converge towards. So what you look at is the lost opportunity before 2008 is that we were headed towards being a have province in a sense, and now we're back to the doldrums again. And in part it's because the traditional engines manufacturing the resource sector, we turned our backs on it.
Now, for people who may not understand what GDP is, could you give us an explanation of what it is and why it's important to the country?
Oh, absolutely. So gross domestic product is a measure of an economy's economic size or a measure of its income. And what it represents is at market prices, it's the value of all final goods and services produced. So it nets out all of the things you use to produce, say, a gallon of gasoline from a barrel of oil. And so what it really represents is the total value of what you're producing. It's your income. And if you divide that by population, you get per capita GDP. And that's a measure of average income in your population, and that's used to measure your standard of living. So the way it works is the more stuff you have, which is your GDP, the better off you are if you have more stuff per person. So the economists like to use GDP as a measure of how well an economy is doing and how fast it's growing, because it's really a measure of how much extra material goods and services you have to provide your population at any point in time. And so if you just think of it as our income, that's the simplest way to think of GDP.
Now, what factors really contribute to the growth of in a country's GDP like Canada?
Well, we're what's called a small open economy, which means we take prices on international markets because we export a lot, and New Brunswick is the most export-dependent province in Canada. Approximately 60%, I think, of what we produce goes abroad, and most of that goes to the United States. So in an economy like ours where we depend on exports and we import a lot as well, most of our growth is going to come from three things. One is how quickly is our population growing? The second is how much is our capital stock increasing? How much investment do we have? And the third is how much research and development and innovation do we have going on? So if we get better at producing things, which means for a given worker in a machine, we get more output, that's innovation, that's technical progress. So when we look at how can we grow, we can add people, we can add capital, or we can get better at doing things.
Now, for a province like New Brunswick, what would you say is like our main exports?
Well, the main exports are obviously petroleum from the refinery in St. John. I think that gets us almost to half. Then you have forest products, most of which are manufactured. And then after that, you start moving into your aquaculture, seafood, and a whole range of metal products as well. So we do a lot of metal fabrication in New Brunswick.
Now, can you talk a bit about GDP increases stemming from employment growth and manufacturing growth, and why one is more beneficial than the other?
So manufacturing is traditionally a sector that's been more capital intensive than, say, working in subway or the service sector. And generally, the more capital you have per worker, the higher is the amount you pay them, because the amount they produce in an hour is that much higher than someone who's in a labor-intensive job. So manufacturing traditionally has had this benefit of being capital intensive, which means it pays higher incomes. And if you think about the pulp and paper sector, it was always known as one with very high wages, in part because it was a very capital intensive way of producing. So when those plants went away and those workers shifted into service sector, we saw high wage jobs giving way to lower wage jobs, which wasn't a good thing. So if you think about why we want to get more employment in manufacturing, we get more value added from a worker in that sector than we, say, do in services. The second thing is we associate manufacturing with its capital intensity as a way of bringing in higher tech production. So if you think about robots and automation and all those other things, which increases our labor productivity and what we can produce in an hour of time or an hour of work, again, that's going to lead to higher incomes, and it's going to lead to more growth.
So in a way, it's like GDP is more effective in a positive way from, say, the metal manufacturing plant than rather the person that's selling the screws from that metal.
Generally, yeah. If you're selling the commodity at the end of the production process, then you're going to make your value added off of your sales. Mm-hmm. But typically, you would have that sales function integrated in with the manufacturer. So they would have a distribution network, let's say in the United States, through a Costco or a Walmart. So again, what you want to think about is the most lucrative companies in the world in manufacturing tend to be vertically integrated, that they own everything up from the bottom of the supply chain right through to the distribution.
Now, when it comes to manufacturing growth, how does Canada compare to other countries in the world?
So that's what's interesting is if you look at the United States and other advanced economies after around 2000, what you see is they've had steady decline in manufacturing employment, but some stability in their value added or GDP from manufacturing. So up until 2008, what Americans and advanced economies were doing is they were getting rid of workers and they were investing in capital. And they were raising labor productivity to keep the total amount they produced the same. After 2008 and the recession, what you see is they stopped investing. They maintained their workforce to some extent after that, but it wasn't as lucrative, and that's when China started coming in with the competitive advantage with lower labor costs and a more favorable currency. So the interesting case for New Brunswick is when you look at Maine, Maine has gone through the same decline in manufacturing employment, but it never saw the productivity growth because, like the rest of the northeast of the United States, it never had the investment coming in. So then we go north of the border to New Brunswick and Ontario, and what you see is we've never had the decline in manufacturing employment to the same degree as the United States, but we've also never had the investment, and the reason is because we had the exchange rate. So when our dollar got cheaper, it was a form of protection against other producers, and it made us cheap because you could buy our goods in US dollars, but we were accepting Canadian dollars to pay our labor. So when we had the exchange rate in our favor, we tended to export a lot, and then when the exchange rate goes towards 1-for-1 with the US dollar, that's when we see the employment adjustment coming in. But we have a roller coaster here in manufacturing with the exchange rate. Whereas other economies, what they did, particularly with population aging, is they invested in machinery and substituted away from labor and moved into higher productivity activities. And as a consequence, they don't have as much trouble paying for an aging population. Because their income per worker is so much higher, they can sustain it with a taxation on that higher income to pay for the dependent ratio that they've got with an aging population. New Brunswick and Ontario, we haven't made any of those adjustments yet. We're still dependent on labor, and now we're running out of workers. And that's where we're hitting some headwinds in New Brunswick.
Now, our overall compound GDP growth is comparable to the United States and Japan, but productivity plays a much larger role for them. Is Canada at a disadvantage because of that?
Absolutely. The real problem we have is that if we're competing on the basis of being cheap, which is coming from low productivity and low wage labor, if we don't have an abundance of labor anymore, that's no longer a competitive advantage. We're going to be under pressure to raise our wages, and if we don't have the productivity to support it, then the capital or the factories will move to where there is higher productivity. And so New Brunswick can't really continue on if it doesn't figure out a way to raise its labor productivity.
Now, our workforce is aging and the amount of people working versus retired is shrinking every year. What does this mean for Canada's GDP future?
Well, the main estimates are what we're going to see is much slower GDP growth, because when you think about what happens with more dependence in the population relative to workers, it means we're taxing the workers more to transfer money to consumption of the dependents. That consumption by dependence means we're not saving and investing. So if you're a worker and I let you keep more of your wages and you're saving for your retirement, your savings are going into capital machinery somewhere else in the economy. If instead I take your money and I give it to your grandparents and they have a nice meal out of it, they feel better, but as a consequence we haven't made that investment, so next year I got to tax you even more. So the concern about the aging population is that the dependency ratio without productivity growth is going to put a drag on investment, it's going to put a drag on productivity and just make it harder to grow.
Now, New Brunswick's labor force peaked in 2008, and by 2020 it will start to shrink. Should this set off alarm bells for the province's economic future?
Not alarm bells. Again, if we were smart, we'd be figuring out policies that would bring in investment to raise labor productivity, and then it doesn't matter if our labor force is shrinking if we can sustain the income. But the other thing to remember, this is a doom and gloom scenario that says we don't have any opportunities to grow the population. We're at a point in time where New Brunswick doesn't want to exploit its natural resource base to the extent it did in the past. And if you look at Saskatchewan, they increased their population from 1 million to 1.2 million in less than a decade and went from an aging population to a getting younger population. So this economy could turn around quickly within 10 years and we won't have this problem of an aging population if we made different choices. But at the moment, New Brunswickers have decided we're not going to exploit natural gas. We don't want to cut as many trees. And we really don't want to help manufacturing. What we want to wait for is more transfers from the federal government, and we want to use the public sector to drive the economy for now. And that's why we're running into a problem, because those higher tax rates are leading to people who earn, say, over $150,000 a year just aren't in our population to the extent they're in other provinces. We have a huge middle class, but we don't have the tax base to sustain the other things. And you're at an age where you'll start looking at the death spiral through taxes and say, am I staying in New Brunswick to pay them, or am I going to go next door where it looks a little better? And there's a lot of New Brunswickers out in Alberta for reasons like that.
Now, our province is falling behind the rest of the country when it comes to workforce. What are the contributing factors to the decline? I don't know if you've already stated this before or not.
For the workforce declining?
Yeah.
Well, the simplest one is just we're aging out. So what New Brunswick has done historically is rationed its jobs for people who are, say, in their prime earning years 25 to 54. So what happens when you're a young New Brunswicker is you can either wait around till your turn comes up, or you could migrate away. And what we've seen is New Brunswick has been a big exporter of young human capital. So we've done that by investing in degrees in universities which have marketable human capital for the graduates across the country and in other countries, but it's not aligned with the emerging labor market needs here with the retirements. So when you think about the workforce challenge, the one is we have a mindset, we like to get rid of our young people, we don't try to keep them. So we have large out-migration. We could stop that just by trying to create more opportunities with the jobs we have, even in the public sector in New Brunswick. The second is we have a complete misalignment of our education system, particularly colleges and universities, with the skills and jobs that there's actually demand. We're going to need 120,000 New Brunswickers or workers over the next 10 years just to replace people who are retiring. And they don't need university degrees for the most part. They need college and they need on-the-job experience. They need to be able to drive heavy equipment. They need to be able to drive a truck, jobs like that. So when you think about what we've been doing to get rid of all the high unemployment in New Brunswick, we've been getting rid of people. We're really good at it, and our workers are in high demand all over the country. But what we have is a huge expense on the public budget that's not designed at solving our problems, it's helping Toronto. And that's where we have a disconnect. The aging population problem we're trying to solve with immigration in the short run, because we don't know how to turn off the human capital exports from the post-secondary system. But when you look at where are the New Brunswickers leaving from, they're leaving from Fredericton, they're leaving from central New Brunswick. Who's staying? They're coming from the north, they're coming down to Moncton. And basically Moncton is growing because you have a different selection of New Brunswickers who are staying there. But for the most part, where we have universities, people leave.
Now, many of our post-secondary graduates from both here and afar leave the province eventually. Now, you've already stated that we're having difficulties having them stay here, and we need the population accordingly, because you're saying that there's going to be need for laborers here in the future. But those that want to pursue post-secondary in different fields, like, is there any way you think that the province can make them stay here? Like, if they don't want to work a labor job?
Oh, absolutely. Like, again, we would take a harder look at where the job opening's coming from, what types of programs do we want to have in place. So we have seen some good emphasis on orienting towards STEM, but in a lot of cases what we need to do is not change the programs we have, but how we deliver our curriculum, so that the core skills that someone needs to go and work in a communications or strategy place, or if you want to work for an actuarial firm or an insurance company like in Moncton, do we have those types of programs here? And the other part of it is just mindset, that if you look at unemployment rates in New Brunswick, they're really high if you're under age 25, they're really low if you're over age 25. Mm-hmm. And what we're doing is we're protecting certain people in the labor market, and we're putting all the risk on the labor market entrance. So you can stay here and wait for a job or wait for your opportunity, or you can move to another market where you can work sooner, or you at least believe there's a higher probability you're going to get the job that you want. So again, New Brunswick is a province that likes to eat its own young, but the polite way of doing it is you get rid of them. They're all living somewhere else. And it's because if this province wants to keep its young, it has to start sharing the opportunities more. There can't be so much protection of jobs for people who are there. You're going to have to open it up to a little bit of competition with your higher skilled workers coming in.
All right. Well, we got to throw this off to break now, so everyone stay with us as we continue to talk about manufacturing in New Brunswick. Back to Voice of the Province. I'm your host, Troy Glover. Tonight we're talking about manufacturing in New Brunswick, as well as economic and labor markets, with Dr. Herb Emery. Dr. Herb Emery is the Vaughan Chair in Regional Economics at the University of New Brunswick. Now, we were talking before we went to break on basically manufacturing and the labor forces in New Brunswick. Now, since the early 2000s, our manufacturing diversity in New Brunswick has stayed well below the Canadian average. Can you make a comment on what happened there exactly?
Well, it's not so much what happened, it's just you have this big dominant industry with petroleum refining that gets really big when there's high demand for gasoline in the US. You have another large industry, everything from wood products to pulp and paper. And so it looks highly concentrated, but it's actually, remember, we're a small province. So it's going to be less concentrated, it's going to be more concentrated than a place like Ontario, where I have 10 million people. Mm-hmm. And I have a wide range of things to do. So on the one hand, what we see is that concentration just reflects how big the dominant industries are. But it also reflects that we've made it hard for some of the other industries to sort of keep up. And again, the headwinds in this province that most recently came in with things like the carbon tax for producers, which is not rebated to the companies as it is for households. We tend to make things harder if you're small. And that has a consequence of making things more likely to be big if they're going to be competitive in export, because the big companies are able to handle more of the headwinds that we have here. But globally, you look at most economies that are succeeding have these big concentrated firms.
So are you saying something around the lines that, like, if there was kind of more leniency towards kind of small New Brunswick-based business, then we might see a better increase in manufacturing, like in a better New Brunswick GDP growth?
Absolutely. So what you have to think about is small businesses have a disproportionate cost when you put on regulation like a minimum wage or work-safe premiums or carbon pricing. So it tends to hit them harder than it does the big companies, because the big companies have scale economies in their administration. If you need to search for labor, if I'm a big company, I can have a human resources department that goes out and looks. If I'm one guy and I have 6 employees and I have to go recruit internationally, that's very difficult to do. Mm-hmm. So what you have to think about is how do you reduce the cost of doing business for a small company so it starts to generate some reserve that can go into investing in capital, that can go into investing in growth. And what we tend to do in New Brunswick is we have a lot of companies that are just clinging on because every time they start to get ahead, something happens here like a carbon tax, like a WorkSafe premium that they hadn't planned for and then they have to adjust to. And so a big message we've had from manufacturers in the province is that every time they just feel like they're about to get to that stage where they can make the next investment, something else happens. And most of it's related to public policy through the government as opposed to economic forces abroad.
Now, New Brunswick is at the bottom of the productivity list alongside its maritime neighbors. Why does the region struggle with productivity in general?
Because the region struggles with investment in general. If you look at the overall cost of doing business, the overall regulatory burden from not harmonizing across even 3 provinces in the region. So if I have different rules for driving my truck across each border I cross, if I face different carbon pricing that I have to do accounting for as I drive my truck across the 3 provinces, if I pay different minimum wages depending on which province my company is operating in, all of these things create a headache compared to when you go to Ontario, which you don't cross boundaries, you have one set of regulations to deal with. You also have more of an attitude in the rest of the country. They want investment and they want business. In the Maritimes, there's sort of an attitude they want to tax business. They want business to pay for things, which is not the mindset you see in other places right now, particularly in the US. They're trying to reduce the tax burden so the capital will locate to increase labor income. And they'll tax the labor income and they'll tax the properties that go up in value. New Brunswick, instead, most of what you hear is, we want to tax business. They need to pay more. They're not paying their fair share, even though there's no way economically to determine what a fair share is. And capital is mobile, so if you tax it, it's going to try and go.
So there's not usually any thought put into whether it's kind of like a base tax with the sense it's not putting into account, like you said earlier, a business that has an HR department, a business that has all these other resources at its disposal because it's already gotten to that growth versus someone that probably only has 10 employees.
Right, and when we think about regulation, you need to think about someone literally sitting down and filling out forms.
Yeah.
And the more forms you have to fill out per hour of time means how much more of your revenue is going to performing that function. So for big companies where they have maybe an even better IT system, they can deal with these costs a little easier than the small guys. So red tape is a huge problem for small and medium enterprises, which is most of our manufacturers, most of our businesses in New Brunswick. And you ask why we struggle in the region, it's because we never let anyone get big anymore. Yeah. And in part, there's a mindset in the Maritimes, which is they don't like big companies. They prefer small and medium size, but that means you're also committing to some kind of business poverty for the long run, as opposed to finding champions who are going to be global successes. If you go around the rest of the world, they're going after the global champions. They're not trying to keep just small and medium. So there's a mindset there. Do you want your businesses to succeed or not?
Now, worldwide, the way business has operated is changing. Can you talk a bit about digitalization, why companies feel this may forever harm their business models?
Well, I'm not sure I've ever heard a company saying that digitization or digitalization would harm their business model. What they worry about quite often is can they afford it? Because the setup costs can be quite high. But digitalization and bringing in Industry 4.0 is a way of increasing your productivity. It's a way of increasing the reach you can have in your markets because you can do things differently. You can figure out your production processes much better in terms of if you had a problem with one run, you don't have to recall everything, just that segment that was coming in. So what we really want to be thinking about is how do we make that transition with the rest of the world to exploit all these new technologies coming in, these new digital platforms. And again, in New Brunswick, to do that, we need businesses that have the access to capital so they can invest in the new machinery that can do a lot of this and the information systems that will help them do it. And it's not just manufacturing. If you think about what would the healthcare system be like if we actually had a digital revolution come in there where we actually had more information on our phones and information on access, what you would see is improved access, improved productivity of that system, and we probably wouldn't be going broke. But instead what we have is everyone in Canada fears this because what they're stuck in their mindset is they remember high unemployment. They've been told that all this automation and digitization leads to layoffs, and therefore we don't want it because we lose jobs. But the correlation in the rest of the world is with an aging population and shrinking workforce, automation and digitization has been the solution because it raises labor productivity and it saves on labor that you don't have. So logically in New Brunswick, we need to be making that transition so we don't have to worry about the labor shortage anymore. It's a solution.
So a lot of time, so would you say it's like in many cases, it's you shouldn't fear the digitalization of business. You should fear not being able to have the opportunity to make investments so you can integrate into it.
Right. Let's take this personally. So I'm assuming you may have something like a smartphone.
Yes.
Do you think you'd be better off if you were back with only a landline?
No.
So this is what we're asking about businesses. Do they want to live with landlines when the rest of the world went to smartphones?
Yeah.
And are smartphones cheap?
No.
Did we figure out a way to pay for them?
Yes.
We sure did. And so when you think about it, what we're trying to figure out is why is business struggling to find the money to make this transition? And in part it's because if I put a tax on you that say every bit of information you use, I'm going to tax you, you're going to stick with your landline a lot longer than if there's one that, say, incents you to take on the new technology. But with a lot of these things, when people say that, I don't understand why businesses would do that, everyone personally has made the jump to high-speed cable. They've made the jump to smartphones. Rogers as a company has basically got every consumer in Canada on board. And so then we talk about a business model for manufacturing. We say, would anyone really want to do that? But it's really like asking, do you want to go back to living in 1984 in terms of the tech you have in your house? And you can do that any day you want.
Yeah. Basically around the lines of, I have a landline, I have a smartphone, but you're going to tell me that each individual app I have to pay a separate fee for on my smartphone?
Yeah, or just we think that you're well off because you have one, so you're going to have a higher personal income tax rate, something like that, or a surtax.
Yeah.
And I think that's coming in the federal election. There's a desire to tax the digital services that we use. So.
Oh, man. Now, there's a fear that 31% of all revenues are at risk over the next 3 years. What does that mean for the world's manufacturing economy?
Well, so manufacturing, there's two levels of it. One is you're building stuff that goes into other production processes. So in New Brunswick, we have a lot of companies that were producing things that were inputs to the oil sands production. Mm-hmm. So since the federal government has decided it doesn't want oil sands production to the same extent, it's actually killed off a lot of demand for what we would produce here. So we're living through some of that reduction already. The other piece that I don't know if it hits us as hard in New Brunswick, but would hit at China, is a lot of manufacturing is for consumer goods. If consumers lose their ability to spend, either through job losses or loss of access to credit, they'll start consuming less. It's going to be a question of who maintains the market share, which is who can produce it as cheaply as possible. And what we'll see is generally just a slowdown in consumer spending and a slowdown in sales of a lot of these companies. And so it's pretty simple when you look at it, is that if people have high incomes and economies are growing globally, we sell a lot of stuff. So the lobster exports and the processing is one of the big manufacturing activities in the region. As long as people have income and want to pay lobster prices, we got a great market. If the global economy slows down and lobster's a luxury and no one wants lobster anymore, we're going to have basically a loss of employment and loss of value added in the region unless we find different markets or unless we find a better way to do what we're doing so that our price point can come down on that.
A very chain reaction sort of situation.
We have to be able to compete.
Now, when people think manufacturing, they may envision like an old school image of industrial age factories. How exactly has this changed, especially over the past decade or so?
Some of the factories I've toured, you almost laugh because everyone wonders what all these guys who got into gaming are going to do for a living. Yeah. You walk into the factory, it looks like a gaming center. What you see is that there's a lot of scanning technology, a lot of automation in the higher performing ones, and it's extremely high tech. In some cases you see robotics, but often it's just a continuous system where you have a scanner deciding where a cut's going to go or how you're going to make something. We're headed into additive manufacturing where it's going to be like 3D printing metal parts like they're doing up at UNB. Yeah. And so it's not the factory that you envision from the old movies. When you go in, it's Some of them look actually incredibly clean and sterilized, almost like a science fiction movie. But again, it's the kind of thing, if you ever do get a chance to go and tour some of these places, I think you'd be blown away by what you see. It's not just you walk in and there's open blast furnaces like they show you in the old steel mills and things like that.
Yeah.
It's often what you see is there's almost more of a command center, and you've got these production lines where things are just moving.
It's like with some shipping companies where they have access to robots that automatically go and pick items or boxes to bring to them themselves, and they're all just on like an iPad.
Yeah.
They bring it towards them. It's not people just running back and forth with packages.
No, most of those routine tasks can be easily automated.
Yeah.
I think a lot of big companies have already made that transition. So again, when you think about like an Amazon, there's still some people running around that warehouse, but I'm guessing most of that is a automated system, and basically you've been hiring Amazon's robots with some storefront when you competed for that.
Yeah.
But what we are living with is, we were taught by a lot of people that manufacturing was a sunset industry. It's associated with the old days of industrial accidents and brutal work conditions. And when you actually go into these places now, it doesn't look anything like that. It's a lot of the places are actually pretty cool to see what they're doing.
Now, with the new look of manufacturing in a digital age, what kind of workforce changes will need to be made to keep it moving forward, would you think?
Well, again, there's a lot of emphasis on it's not just what do we train the new workers to do, we also have to reskill a lot of workers. Mm-hmm. So with new apps and systems coming in, a lot of people are going to have to learn how to use the new controls. They're going to have to learn how the new bots are working with things. They're going to have to learn what's the new production flow. So in a lot of cases, what we need is more kids just going in and learning things like logistics. Like, how does it work to get something from the port to the truck into the factory shop? How do you do the management of the delivery of your parts and where things are going to go? So a lot of it's much more focused and practical in terms of what skills you need, as opposed to a generic, you should learn to read and write. A lot of it is, I think you've got to be more of a problem solver. We've learned they're looking for people who can do strategic thinking, even thinking on the fly on the floor. So if something goes sideways on you, can you fix it? If you're working out in the field somewhere and your equipment breaks down, you're going to have some skills to figure out how to fix it. So one of the interesting things I learned from the event we ran a couple weeks ago is there's actually a strong preference for people coming from a rural background, because they tend to have a very practical kind of training in their background, and when they get into a manufacturing environment, they're actually quite handy when different things need to be done. So it's not as prescriptive as you need to go and be a welder, mm-hmm. or you need to go and do carpentry. It comes down to more, what are you going to do on the job? What tools or apps are you going to use? What's the systems you need to be familiar with? It might even be, what are the safety codes you need to know? Just getting you up to speed on those kinds of things that much quicker. But again, a lot of it's just orientation to what do you do on the job? How long are your work days going to be? What do you do if you're at one station versus another? What are the transferable skills you need to pick up? And a lot of it may just be learning different control systems on different types of machines.
Now, there's always been a fear of automation when it comes to jobs. How can industry introduce automation and still keep people employed? I know you kind of made reference to just more training and making sure people are integrated to the systems themselves. So
the interesting part is, a lot of robotics, they don't replace people completely. What mm-hmm. they do is they replace parts of the person's job. So what you need is that someone's not going to do a routine thing like carrying a box from point A to point B. They've got something else, the conveyor will take it. So now what's that worker going to do with their time? They're going to put it towards some other use. So it might be maintaining a machine, it might be monitoring some of the process, making sure things are going through, but you may have to reskill them, or you may need to upskill the worker who's there. So before it was manual labor, now you've got an electrician who's monitoring what's going on. So you may wind up with the same number of workers, but they're higher skill and higher productivity. You may wind up with more people working just because the increased productivity from the automation actually makes you more competitive, so you export more, so you actually have to scale up your entire production.
All right. We have to cut to break now for a minute. Everyone, please stay with us as we continue to talk about manufacturing and the economic and labor markets in New Brunswick. Hello and welcome back to Voice of the Province. I'm your host, Troy Glover. Tonight we're talking about manufacturing and the economic and labor markets in New Brunswick. And for that we have Dr. Herb Emery, the Vaughan Chair in Regional Economics at the University of New Brunswick. Now before we were talking about automation on the jobs, now by 2030, 30 to 40% of the workforce will need to be reskilled or change their position. Is this a target a place like New Brunswick can meet?
Not at the current pace, no.
No?
But the interesting part is, if the labor market can adjust by signaling with high wages where people are in demand, that should trigger a response either by people moving to the province to fill those or workers reacting to the incentive. My concern in New Brunswick is that the wage signal doesn't really work. And in part it's because there's so many different taxes already loaded on to labor that when you think about from the employer's perspective, they pay you the wage, which you don't think is very high, but they're also paying the WorkSafe premium, any benefits. They're also paying the paid holidays and things along those lines. And if you look at New Brunswick over the last 10 years, it just kept adding to the labor cost. So what they've done is they've created a wedge, which is between what the employer pays for an hour of work and what the worker receives. So until we can sort of bring those two closer in line so that when a worker is in demand, because they're scarce or we need that skill so the wage can go up to signal to people, please go and take that degree or diploma or certificate, you kind of have things that are stalled. And other places where they need a trade of a particular kind or a skill, you start to hear, hey, in Toronto they're paying this for what I do. And so you tend to see migration out as a response until we can get that labor market functioning again.
Now, we've heard from some manufacturers in the province, for example, Irving and Chipman, and they've had to look outside the country to find skilled workers needed to fill newer technology-centric jobs. Now, why would you say we're falling so behind in that sector?
Well, again, there's a couple of reasons. One is we're not training our own to move into those jobs, or the second, we don't pay a wage that's competitive with what our own that we've trained can get somewhere else. So we have to figure out the mystery is why aren't New Brunswick employers able to raise their wages to compete with employers elsewhere? So we should be taking a hard look at what are the impediments to getting this labor market functioning again through its wage signal. So one reason immigration becomes attractive is we can go to lower wage countries, find people with great skills and bring them here at a wage rate or an income that they don't find too bad. And when we start to rely solely on immigration because we're not able to retain our own people, it tells us that we're using a backfilling to get the labor we need. But we could be doing more if we just let the wages run free. They could actually come up, and we might get the signals to keep people around. Now, I don't want to disparage immigration because immigration is being used throughout the country to find skills that we don't have in Canada. And without immigration, this country wouldn't really be advancing right now. And New Brunswick also needs to get better at taking more advantage of the newcomers who are already here. There's a lot of high-skilled newcomers who can't even get called back for an interview. So there's also a problem, I think, with the New Brunswick labor market. It's not very good at identifying talent. It tends to go with people and resumes that they recognize. It tends to go on backgrounds that they find predictable. But that's also one of the things that's probably holding them back from finding the talent that they need. There needs to be a different approach to human resources generally in the province.
Now, are post-secondary students to focus on just getting a diploma and not focusing on getting the specific training needed for the future workforce of the province?
So it's not really their fault. They're encountering a system that's been established to run programs that are based on who was hired over the last 30 years. And so the degree programs we offer is more a function of who we have on staff and what kind of courses do we teach. And in the past, it's never been a pressure to come up with this experiential learning. You were expected to go out after graduation, find some volunteer opportunities, internships, starter jobs, and ladder your way up. Maybe you do a second degree. But increasingly, the pressure is to have job-ready graduates right out of the BA. Now, the reason New Brunswick needs to do that is because if you're not job-ready for New Brunswick, you can migrate to a province where there is more work opportunity right away, particularly Western Canada, and probably start your career much sooner. we did a study of New Brunswickers who'd moved to Alberta and then moved back. And we compared them to people who moved out to Alberta and stayed, and we compared them to people who'd never left. And what we found was New Brunswickers who left for Alberta typically earn, we'll call it, twice as much as people who stayed in New Brunswick, the same age and education and everything else. For the ones that stayed compared to the ones who came back, they still earned twice as much. The ones who came back earned as much as the ones who never left, which tells us that the low wages is a function of this place, not the people. You take the same person out of New Brunswick and they're worth twice as much in Alberta. And the whole difference is there's more investment in Alberta, there's more capital, and it was coming through the energy sector. So in terms of what do graduates need, in Alberta they need a lot less than they need here. Because here what we're trying to do is fine-tune everything because we don't have the opportunities. And so if you want to get a good job, you're going to need some experience, and we could be doing a lot more with our programs in post-secondary. We could be doing more co-ops. We could do more interns. We could integrate real-world experience type exercises into the curriculum. But if we have a program that's largely you take tests for 4 years and then we graduate you, you're basically someone who's got a certificate, but you may or may not have encountered anything unless you were great at extracurricular and summer jobs.
Mm-hmm. Now, going back into manufacturing, what are some of the indirect contributions of manufacturing?
Well, manufacturing, again, before, that's typically where you have your R&D is often focused in there through the business sector, but that's incredibly weak in this region. We rely much more on federal government for driving research and development through universities. But if we had a more vibrant manufacturing sector, we have the potential spillover more research and development and innovation. High-paid jobs tend to spill over that we have higher incomes, which generates more service demand for service sector activities. If we have more manufacturers, we need a supply chain that might induce more businesses feeding into what the manufacturers need as inputs and displacing some things that we're currently importing. So the spillovers can be quite broad, but the best way to think of it as this is a high-wage sector, good-paying jobs, and it creates innovation through research and development if the producers have the capacity to invest in that. If you're going to make them live based on their current cash flow, they're never going to make those investments and you won't see those benefits.
Now, we might have discussed this a little bit already, but let's get more into it. Focusing on the opportunities for growth in New Brunswick, what factors have to come together, would you say, to make that work?
Well, the best way to put it is if people believe this is a good place to produce, meaning they think they can earn a return or make a profit here, they'll invest. So what we should be looking at is why is there no investment in New Brunswick in order to grow our capital stock? So how do we compare in terms of our tax competitiveness with other regions, and not just the corporate income tax? What goes on with personal income taxes for your executive class? Do they want to locate here if you're trying to recruit? What are we doing with property tax? What are we doing with power rates? They used to be low industrially, now they're not. They're more comparable to places we compete with. If you're a resource-based producer, what's your access to the inputs you need? And then most importantly, our government's creating an environment where there's any predictability on your costs year to year. And what we've seen in New Brunswick since I moved here in 2016 is there's just constant change and constant uncertainty over what the next policy is going to be. The most recent one is at a time where you have a minority government, someone was actually able to bring forward a proposed tax on machinery and equipment through the property tax base, which would have been a huge change in the tax burden on particularly pulp mills in Nacawick and up in Atholville. Those are big manufacturing establishments, and they're probably in those places because the property is not expensive, they've got the labor that they need, and they have the access to wood. But if you're going to tax all the capital that's inside those buildings that was previously exempted, that might kill that off. So the good news is you're not going to do it, but you still talked about it. In the United States, everyone's listening, and they're talking about eliminating any taxes on things like machinery and equipment. So we have to get more predictability. We have to get more in line with other jurisdictions so that investors say New Brunswick is a good place to be versus I want to be in Quebec, which is more favorable through its tax system, or I want to be down in Boston, someplace like that. We could think about enhancing the R&D capacity with university researchers that are more oriented towards industrial problems, like you're seeing out of UNB with the Advanced Additive Manufacturing Center, the small modular reactors for nuclear. We've got research capacity going in there as well at UNB. So it's largely a mindset, and it's largely focusing your policies on creating conditions that producers want to be here. And right now, I don't think we have that combination of forces.
Now, family businesses play a big role in New Brunswick's manufacturing industry. Can you talk a bit about the kind of contributions they make to the overall picture?
Well, they're the majority in some cases of the big companies in particular that are producing most of the value added in manufacturing. And it's also the case that a lot of the big companies in Canada were either originally family businesses that have since diversified their ownership, or they're still family held to some degree. So New Brunswick's not unique in terms of the rest of Canada that way. But what's interesting about them is they're far more committed to the province than I think an external company would be. That external companies would have been long gone with some of the policies here, but what you see instead with family businesses with roots in the provinces like Imperial Manufacturing and Richibucto, they tend to stick it out, whereas in other places you might see the companies would have said, we're going somewhere else. And certainly that was the experience in the northeast of the province, where a lot of those big pulp mills were external companies. The ones that stayed tended to be the domestic family-owned companies like the Irvings or Twin Rivers.
Now, a thriving manufacturing sector depends on contributions from an entire ecosystem. This includes government, startups, investors, and more. How important is it to having that cross-sector collaboration as you try to kickstart an industry?
Well, to kickstart an industry, I think it would be pretty critically important. And the one to watch would be the small modular reactors that are being done around Point Lepreau down around St. John. And that's basically your living lab right now, if you want to see how important these things are. And they're going to need a supply chain developing so that they have the inputs they need to produce these reactors. They need someone to procure the first couple of plants so that they can demonstrate that this works, say a pilot project type thing. They need government working on the regulatory environment so that they can get all the approvals they need to advance the technology and produce. And more importantly, they're going to need training programs that are producing people that can work in this new industry. And they're predicting if it works, they'll have 6,000 jobs directly building small modular reactors, which is the size of the forest sector in New Brunswick. And then it would be about 18,000 indirect jobs was their forecast that would be produced through the supply chain and the induced services. So if you think about adding an industry of that size, it's quite remarkable that we would just add another forest sector. Now for that to work, that whole combination of forces you referred to has to come together. Now, if we move forward to the established businesses, the lost opportunity in New Brunswick is that if we don't worry about the competitiveness of our service providers and our supply chain companies, the big companies can just import a lot of what they need, even from places like Ontario. And so when we put a tax burden on a small company that could otherwise be providing boxes or inputs to one of the bigger producers, and that company says the local guy's too expensive, they can't get their costs down, we're just going to bring it in from Montreal, we're losing an opportunity. And one of the things that we found is manufacturing has held its own since 2008, but where New Brunswick differs from the rest of Canada is that we didn't see the non-manufacturing workforce or value-added grow like it has everywhere else, which tells us that we resorted to importing rather than making sure we had the conditions to grow our overall business sector to take advantage of the resilience of the manufacturers that were actually doing quite well exporting. And that's a huge leakage from our potential to grow. And so we need to think a lot more about not just the business climate for manufacturers, but the business climate for all the small business and medium businesses that could be feeding into that ecosystem.
Now, how could you say New Brunswick could increase its global export?
We either find new markets, we find more market share in the United States, we find more market share in Canada. All of them require the same thing, which is we get better at what we're doing every year. So if you think about what's going to get you market share, it's going to be a combination of being able to produce at a lower cost than everyone else, or you can produce a better quality product that's in higher demand. And so what you've seen a lot in New Brunswick is companies moving up the value-added chain. They move from producing a commodity towards producing a processed product. So instead of 2x4s, you see a lot more tissue paper being exported. And the value of a tree when it's turned into toilet paper is way higher than 2x4s, just because a little fiber goes a long way when you put it into a toilet roll. And so in a lot of cases, there's been an attempt to disparage using trees for toilet paper, but the demand for toilet paper is so lucrative that you can't expand that market.
Now, if a business doesn't try to tackle a worldwide market, is there a risk that the market itself may leave it behind?
Well, you got to remember, so when we talk about world markets, we're talking in abstract, and it works well for commodities, like if we're just selling logs, or if we're selling a barrel of oil. But when you start to get into manufactured products, what you're often looking at is, can you get access to a distributor like a Costco or a Walmart? Or are you working with someone who's going to get your product into a market? And so what you're doing is you're not trading with companies or with a global, you're trading with a distribution network and figuring out how to get in there. And to be in a lot of those chains, as I understand it, you've got to be able to produce on a certain scale, and you've got to be reliable, because they're going to be pushing a lot of product. So we have to think about, to get our global reach, we probably have to let our big guys get bigger. We have to get more competitive, which the scale economies would allow us to bring those costs down, and the big companies may be the ones most likely to invest in Industry 4.0, which is the one that gets us into the cool digitalized stuff and the automation that makes us even more productive. But in a small open economy, that's not going to lead to layoffs. That might actually increase the scale of those firms so that they actually employ more people. And if you're more productive, you get higher wages out of it. So the gamble that people will say I'm playing with is that they don't believe that this virtuous circle will work, even though if you go back to the 1940s, this is exactly what made Canada and the United States rich, was this cycle of investment, R&D, innovation, and ever-growing labor productivity. The only time things got bad is when innovation slowed down and R&D, labor productivity stopped growing, and then we started having too many people for the jobs that were available.
Okay. Well, it looks like actually that's all the time we have for tonight. Thank you so much, Herb, for joining us tonight. Dr. Herb Emery is the Vaughan Chair in Regional Economics at UNB. Tonight we were talking about manufacturing and the labor and economic markets in New Brunswick. I'm your host, Troy Glover. This was Voice of the Province, and I'd like to wish everyone watching a good night.